Good evening. Thank you for attending the June 24th, 2024 meeting of the Westerville City Schools Board of Education. This evening's agenda will be displayed on the screens in the front of the room. Printed agendas are available for our guests at the back of the room, or you may find the agenda on your mobile device by connecting to the district's website at www.wcsoh.org. Click on the Our District link, select Board of Education, and then follow the Board Docs link to our current meeting agenda. There will be two opportunities to address the board this evening. The first meeting agenda item 6.01. The first set of comments is relative to the agenda item 7.01 through 11.05. Please state the agenda items you're referencing at the beginning of your comments. The second opportunity is agenda item 12.01. There's a sign-up sheet located on the table in the back of the room. Each speaker will have 5 minutes to address the board. A timer will be shown on the screen. And with that, Ms. Marshall, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Davidson?
Here.
Dr. Nestbaker is absent. Mrs. Valentine?
Here.
Mrs. Altman?
Here.
Mrs. Meyer?
Here. Would you please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. District highlights, and we have in recognitions, and tonight we have none. Next up is the superintendent's report. Ms.
Thank
Lindberg.
you. Appreciate that. Tonight, I just have a very quick update. I wanted to make sure everyone was aware where we are with our strategic planning process. And so I want to first thank our committee. We have about 50 folks who have been serving on that committee, many community members and school employees who have spent many nights that are about as nice as this one, sitting in this room helping us with that plan. So I really appreciate all their time and effort. We're getting close. We had a meeting on June 12th, and we got really good feedback on the content of the objectives, but some concern on the wording and wanting to try to simplify that a little bit. So we are working through that, and we are targeting July 8th to bring that to you. So as soon as we have those updated objectives, I'll send those out to the board members ahead of time so that you get a chance to read those. And then we will be meeting as an administrative team with the impact group also on July 8th to start working on the action steps and what those look like internally to start executing those objectives. So starting to draft those, planning to bring that for your approval on the evening of the 8th, and then excited to roll that out to our community. Does anyone have any questions on that? All right, thank you. That's all I had to share tonight.
That's great. Thank you. Next up, we have a motion to approve the minutes of the regular Board of Education meeting held on Monday, June 10th of 2024.
So moved. Second.
Any comments, questions, discussion? All right, Ms. Marshall, will you call the roll?
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. There are no public comments, and so next up we have the financials. May I have a resolution to, or a motion to approve the resolution of necessity of bond issue and levy of a tax in excess of the 10 mil limitation, and to submit the question of the same to the electors?
So moved. Second.
And Ms. Marshall, will you talk to us about this?
Yes, thank you, President Meyer, members of the board. So this is our first resolution for the combination to be on the ballot this fall for the combination for a bond issue for $140 million, which is estimated to be 1.7 mils. The county will certify the rates and the amounts, but we're estimating that to be a no new millage ask of the community. And then also the 4.9 mil operating that we've been discussing. I do just want to point out, there's been some conversations around values increasing, and there's a lot of residents that are challenging the values that the county auditor has set for them. Should there be some large decrease in property values as a whole in the school district, that voted millage of 4.9 mils, should that be approved in November, the millage will never go above 4.9 mils because of House Bill 920 will adjust the rate down as values increase. And if values decrease, it will adjust the rate back up, but only to the voted millage. So I just want to make sure that that's clear to everybody of how that works. And for the bond issue, it's up to $140 million. And so if something were to happen, then that millage would end up being higher. We would revisit that conversation, I think, and see where we would go from there. So I just wanted everybody to be aware of
that. Ms. Marshall, I'm just wondering if you can just articulate the steps here, like this say first, you know.
Yes, so this is so we had the state consent for the bond portion on the June 10th meeting. So that's been filed with the Department of Education and Workforce and the Ohio Department of Taxation, which is required. And now we have, this is the first resolution of necessity, and this simply clarifies our intent to the county auditor that we intend to bring back a resolution to be on the with the Board of Elections, be filed with the Board of Elections, but this is asking them to certify what will 4.9 mils generate, and then what is the bond millage for a $140 million bond issue. So that's what this is doing. There's 2 certificates attached to this resolution that will be filed with the county auditor. They'll get that back to us. The next step, in order to actually be on the ballot, would be the resolution to proceed. And so I intend to bring that to you on the July 8th agenda in order to meet the deadlines that the Board of Elections has in order for us to be on the ballot this fall. And I do just want to remind everybody that this fall is the general election, and the cost of the actual election is minimal to the district because it is a general election. If we were to miss that deadline and have to wait until the spring to go on, we would have the full cost of the election in order to be on the ballot in the spring. So I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware of that.
Great, thank you for clarifying. This is not the last step.
No, not the last step. And so if the board approves the resolution on July 8th, then I would literally drive to the Board of Elections and file it in Franklin County and Delaware County. Yeah. And that's what triggers for us to be on.
Ms. Marshall, I have a question.
Sure.
So as we all appreciate our taxpayers so much, and we know that the state does require us to send some of our public taxpayer dollars to some private schools. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the services that we provide to private schools?
Yeah, so as I mentioned to the board in the work session, there's transportation. We have a couple of buses that just transport St. Paul students. Of our 119 routes that we have with van and bus routes, we have about 33 of those routes that are busing students that don't attend schools in Westerville City Schools, but a private or charter school within the school district. And so I'm going to invite Gertie Glass up to share with the board about specialized learning and some of the services that we provide around that.
Nicole, when we're short on bus drivers, does it impact those other schools?
It does not.
So it just impacts us?
Yes.
Thank you.
Superintendent Hember. So what I have in front of me is a list of all of the schools that we have around here. So if I could just like name them for you
Yeah.
and what the services that we provide.
I don't think so.
Now, okay, I'm so sorry. So what I have in front of me is a list of all of the schools that we have, that we service, and also all of the services that we provide for them. So we have a school here in Westerville, Ohio, called All of the Children of the World. So with that, we provide Title II, and I'm going to tell you guys what they are. Or do you guys want me to list them first?
Okay.
Title I is whenever we have students who are in schools that do not meet the threshold for just, socioeconomic. So with that, they receive Title I services. Sometimes it's in reading, sometimes it's just like, we have extra teachers in the building, whatever that might be. Title II is PD. Title III is ESL. Title IV is Wellness, which is in the office of Tammy Center, and Title 6B, Part B is your special ed. So some of the schools that we have, for example, All the Children of the World, they receive auxiliary Title II, Title IV, Title VI, Part B for special ed. St. Paul, for example, also receive all of those services. And Northside Christian also received Title II, Title IV, Title VI, Part B. Oakstone received Title II and Title IV. Eastwood receives auxiliary, Title II, Title III, Title IV, Title VI, Part B. Central Christian, Title II, Title IV, Title VI, Part B, and Christian Life. So what that means is if we have students that are in need of special ed services, we have to send people over there to service them. And some of the schools also receive nursing services, for example. And because they are in our school, we also have child find responsibilities. So we have to make sure that, we go into the schools to ensure the students are in need of any kind of services, and we make sure that we provide all of those for them.
And we're also responsible for any IEP writing.
So we are always in charge of ETR child find. So some of the schools, because the students always do not reside here, so we'll have to share the ETR with the schools where the students reside. But we also have a lot of the students, because they are here, that we also have to write either services plans or also IEP for them.
So, I'm sorry.
Can you say what those are? Because I think acronyms are hard for people.
ETR, absolutely. It's just like whenever you have an evaluation to provide services for whatever the student is in need of. So a psychologist comes in and they look at the whole child to make sure that, the student does not have any kind of disability, such as in, behaviors, reading, math, or what have you. So based on the ETR, multifactorial evaluation that is written, then we find out what the services are, and we write an IEP, which is an individualized education plan to provide services for all our students.
So the other piece I want to mention, when she talks about the title funding and the auxiliary services, there are grant dollars that flow through the district, and we're required to work with those schools to administer those grant dollars through services. On the federal funding side, so all of the title funds that you hear about, that is just an administrative burden that we have. For the auxiliary services, we are able to charge like a 4% administrative fee to those grants, and that's a state grant. But the 4% doesn't nearly cover all of the work that goes into all of the planning and just the timing with us having to have the staffing available in case there is that need in the next school year, if that makes any sense.
And if I'm so you rattled off, I think, 6 or 7 schools, right? But some of those have
we have more.
multiple
Correct.
locations within our school district.
No. So we have, what do you mean?
So are there more than like one Oakstone?
Well, yes, they do have 2 Oakstones, but it depends on the services that they are receiving. And right now, I do not believe that they are receiving any of we don't write any services plan for them. So they do have 2 locations, but I don't think it really impacts us as much as all the other schools that are located right in here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we have an employee, Juliet Peoples, who works with our non-public schools to help plan with some of that stuff as well.
And do we, do we have an idea of how much that really, like what that total cost is to our district?
I don't know that we have ever calculated the full cost, because it would require, I guess, timekeeping on administrators and anybody that would be involved with any of that planning and all the things. I think at the end of the day, it's just important to understand that because we are the resident district, we are at the end of the day responsible for any of the needs to get that child educated, even in some cases where they've chosen to go to an outside school district or school.
But it does impact us every single day,
Absolutely.
Every day.
every single day,
It does.
probably in multiple ways.
Yes.
I think a big piece too is there's such a shortage right now with staffing, and in particular, as you look at Gertie's department and our special education staff, we have a hard time finding enough psychologists. So when we have to send them, she mentioned, I didn't want to gloss over, not only do we have to service the needs of kids who live here, but because those schools are in the boundaries of Westerville City Schools, we actually have to send people out to do the testing and identify kids who live in other districts as well. So it's not just for our students who live in our boundaries, but kids who attend school at these private schools in our boundaries, we have to go out. And so we're having actually a hard time right now. We have multiple psychologist positions posted. So we are having a hard time finding enough psychologists to service our own students, but we are required then to send them out to these other schools to do these assessments. So that's a big challenge that I just wanted to highlight.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.
This is sort of a ridiculous thought experiment, but I just want to, so if all the students who attend our buildings every day disappeared, we would still have to stay in business to do all of these other things. I mean, the reason
theory.
right, in theory, the reason I say that is that I think a lot of times people look at our schools and just think about the buildings that we run every day. But the truth is, we're providing services outside of those buildings that a lot of people don't see,
Right.
whether it's busing or the services that Ms. Glass is talking about. So I use that ridiculous thought experiment because it's invisible work, I think. But under that scenario, it wouldn't be invisible anymore, and we would still have to do it. So,
And so I think it's important to just highlight, and I know I talk a lot about this, but the increase in the voucher program, and how that continues to grow and the resources continue to be added to those, to non-public schools, and that the accountability around that is nothing. The report cards, the financial audits, they have none of that. And so as parents are comparing, you know, their opportunity at a public school versus a private school, they have no way to compare apples to apples in determining what's a best fit for their child, just by looking at what the data that's available, so.
Any other questions? Thank you, Ms. Glass.
Thank you.
Thank you for explaining all that.
Ready to vote?
Yes, please.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the financial report and investments for May 2024? The financial report lists all of the funds ending in May of 2024.
So moved?
Second.
And Ms. Marshall, will you talk to us again about this?
Yes, thank you again. Ms. Davidson, was that you that moved it, or was it Altman? Okay, sorry. So this is the May 31st month-end financial report. So this is the second to the last month of the fiscal year. Our fiscal year ends June 30th. So for the general fund, we had year-to-date receipts of $212.2 million, year-to-date expenditures of $187.7 million, unencumbered fund balance of $195.4 million, and that's for the general fund. And for all funds, we had year-to-date receipts of $291.3 million, year-to-date expenses of $291.9 million, and we ended with unencumbered fund balance for all funds of $222.5 million. And that is the month of May.
Any questions, discussion? All right, Ms. Marshall, will you take the call?
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the resolution for the final appropriations for all funds of school year 2023 through 2024, fiscal year 2024?
So moved.
Second?
And Ms. Marshall?
Thank you again. So these, we have permanent appropriation amendments. So these will be our final appropriations for fiscal year. As we're coming towards the end of the fiscal year, we want to true those up with expenditures, and then we have that updated amount that was added for the capital projects transfer that wasn't in the previous appropriations. And so that's why you see that large increase.
Any questions, comments? All right, Ms. Marshall, will you take the vote, please?
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve a resolution for the temporary appropriations for all funds for school year 2024 through 2025, which is fiscal year 2025?
So moved. Second?
And Ms. Marshall, will you talk to us about this one?
Yes, so this is our temporary appropriation. So this will allow us to start paying bills beginning at the new fiscal year, July 1st. So these are temporary. We'll come back in September for permanence as required by board policy in Ohio law.
Any questions or comments? All right.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the resolution establishing a capital projects fund for the purpose of accumulating resources for the acquisition, construction, or improvement of fixed assets?
So moved. Second?
And Ms. Marshall, will you talk to us about this?
Yes, so we have discussed this in previous meetings. So this is the resolution. This will allow us to create a capital projects fund. And so this is part of the bond package. And so the intention here is to keep the bond millage at a no new millage amount. And so this will allow us to continue with the facilities master plan and the work that needs to be done, and keeping that bond millage at that no new millage amount. And that's the intention here. Now, just want to point out, this is in the fund to be planned for. Should that need to be moved back for any reason, we're always able to do that too. If for some reason we didn't have these projects happening or anything like that.
Where does this particular money, is it coming out of a general fund? Where is it coming from?
Yeah, it's coming from the general operating fund. So it was included in the updated 5-year forecast to move that money out of the general fund.
And Ms. Marshall, since we're just considering putting issues on the ballot,
Yes.
so $30 million, if we transfer this out of the general fund and into this, into this new fund for capital projects, would we still need to put the same levy on the ballot if we weren't transferring this money? Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. And the answer to that is yes. So when we look at operating millage, we are looking at ongoing and growing costs. So this money is being used on one-time, non-recurring expenses. And so if we were to use that money on ongoing recurring expenses, we would create a much larger gap in revenues and expenses over time, and the millage would be much, much higher at a later date. So regardless of whether this transfer were to happen or not, I would still be recommending the same millage amount at the same time as what we have here.
Okay, thank you for walking through that.
And you had mentioned that in moving this money over to the capital projects fund, if we needed to move it back, it could be moved back. When would we be thinking of actually using those funds for capital improvements?
So there will be a period of design that will be happening throughout the next, I want to say 6 months. Yeah, 6 months.
Okay, perfect.
Any other questions? Great, thank you. Can you take the vote?
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the transfer of funds as presented?
So moved.
Second?
Ms. Marshall? You have a lot.
Sorry, this is a really busy agenda for me, fiscal year end stuff. So I'm looking for my list. I'm sorry. It's not jumping out at me. So we have several fund-to-fund transfers on this list, on the attachments if you pull it up. But the general fund to the turf replacement fund, so that's part of our permanent improvement fund. We transfer $65,000 a year to build up an amount for eventual turf replacement at our high schools in the stadiums. And then our food service fund, so we started this last year with the negative balances in the food service fund. Because the food service fund is a federal fund, it can't hold negative lunch debt beyond the 5 meal charges. And I was told earlier, the way I pronounce meal is confusing when we talk about levies and food. So lunch and breakfast charges. So sorry. So I just want to make sure it's very clear. Any student that has a negative balance in the food service system that's less than the equivalent of those 5 lunches, their balances will not be moved. They stay in the food service fund. It'll still be on their food service account. Anything in excess of that, the general fund has to cover that debt because the food service fund, being a federal fund, cannot. And so that debt will be added to the Power School fees at the beginning of next year. So we did this past year. We'll do that again this year. So we have to collect that debt. It is a negative debt to the district and to the taxpayers. So that will be added to Power School. It'll show up in fees in August, and people will be able to go on and pay just like they would pay any other school fee that they would have.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, please.
And so if someone goes into Power School and they see their fee and it's more than the typical fee that they have, would it say this is a lunch balance fee?
Yes, it'll have that listed.
Great.
They have it broken out.
This might be a dumb question, but what if they can't afford to pay said lunch balance?
So the fee stays with them. And it is a fee that the family owes. So if for some reason, we have some community groups that have covered negative lunch balances for families. We've had lots of donations towards the negative lunch balances and things like that. We have to apply those evenly because of just how the law works, but yeah. So I would suggest anyone reach out to their building principal and and talk to them if they're having trouble with that.
But we're still feeding kids. We're not denying.
We are going to continue
Kids'
to feed
food.
kids.
Yeah. I guess I was just interested in if a child is going into kind of the next grade level and they've got a substantial lunch balance and the parents are like, I can't afford to pay that. Do they still get to come to school, or do they have
Oh,
to
yes.
pay that
They
before they?
They still get to come to school.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you feed them.
And we feed them, yeah.
And they can sign up for free and reduced lunch if they're
Mhm.
Yes.
qualified.
Yeah. The other piece too is there are there's some opportunities that fees have to be paid before students can participate at some levels. So there's some of that too.
We're just really lucky that we have such a generous community
We are,
that constantly is helping our kids out.
yeah, that
So,
amount would be
very
way
grateful for
larger
that.
if not for all of the donations we've
Yes.
received throughout the year. For sure.
About how many families does this affect every year?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but, so we're coming off of where we had lunch at no cost
Yeah.
after COVID.
Yep.
And so I think that's where some of this is coming from.
Okay.
But I know the food service department and the building send out a lot of communication around, just that this is the case, so,
Yeah.
and trying to help in any way that they can.
Great.
So the other, the capital projects fund is on the list, and then we have unclaimed funds. After a certain period of time, we move those to the general fund under law, and then we have several tournament accounts that will go to the athletic accounts. And then we have some obsolete student accounts and student groups that will go to the principal's accounts.
Any other questions? All right, we take the vote.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the advance of funds from the general fund to grant funds as presented?
So moved.
Second?
And Ms. Marshall, will you talk to us about
me
these?
again. So these are advances. So the difference between transfers is money going out and it doesn't come back to the originating fund. Advances are, we're sending money out, but it will be repaid by the fund that received the advances. So we are, again, not able to hold negative balances in grant funds, so especially the federal funds. And so the Department of Education and Workforce stops accepting requests in like early June. And so as we have expenses in mid-June, late June, we're not able to always get project cash requests in to cover those expenditures, depending on timing and all that. And so we will do these advances to make sure that we don't have negative cash accounts for grants. And then in the new year, fiscal year, starting in July, we'll be able to repay the general fund back for those advances.
Any questions there? All right, will you take the vote?
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the purchases in accordance with Ohio Revised Code 5705.41D1 and Board Policy 6320?
So moved?
Second?
And Ms. Marshall, will you talk to us about these?
Yes, so this is what we call then and now purchase orders. And this is where we have a purchase order that was open after an invoice date. You have 5 in front of you tonight. So there are 2 for Central High School. The Project Lead the Way purchase order is, we had a purchase order open. It had been closed inadvertently a little bit early, and so this is really a replacement purchase order for that. And then the West Star Hotel Partners, so this is actually for 2025 prom reservation. So when they go and to get a quote, they date based on the quote for the first payment for the invoice. And so that's why that's on there. And then we had 2 for food service. We also had purchase orders open, and those got closed inadvertently. And then the Vertiv Corporation for IT, they that was due to timing. It was that's from a previous year. They didn't bill for us, and so that purchase order got closed as part of the fiscal process. And so, but the money is all appropriated, and I do recommend that the board approve it so we can get them paid in July. They won't be paid until July because we're closing out the year now, so.
Any questions? Okay. Will you take the vote?
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the resolution designating public depositories of the active and interim deposits of the school district?
So moved.
Second.
And Ms. Marshall?
I think this is my last one for
Yeah.
this section anyway. I have some more, but excuse me. So every 5 years, we approve public depositories, and this resolution allows us to name the opportunity for us to enter into depository agreements with banks that have submitted their application and interest. So we currently work with First Commonwealth Bank. We intend to continue to work with them as our main bank that we work with. We also hold investments with Fifth Third Securities, and U.S. Bank and Huntington Bank are loan bond payment servicers for us. So the CNB Bank, I think is what it's called. So that's a new bank that has submitted its interest for application. And so I don't know that we'll actually end up agreeing to a depository agreement with them. I'm still working through some of the details on their application, but I would like to keep them on this list just to give us the option should we want to do that.
Any questions? Okay. Will you take the vote?
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And next up, and can I take this all as one? May I have a motion to approve the personal consent agenda 8.01 through 8.16?
So moved.
Second?
Welcome, Mr. Cooper.
Good evening, President Meyer, Vice President Altman, members of the board, Interim Superintendent Hamburg, and Miss Marshall. Miss Marshall, I meant to bring you a towel or a Gatorade or something. Best time of the year to be a treasurer, right? This evening's personnel consent agenda includes action items with regard to resignations, retirements, leaves of absence, contract status changes, one-time pays, and other employment-related decisions. Additionally, there are 3 MOUs with our OPSI union groups recommended for your approval this evening. We have 2 staff members who have announced their retirement on this evening's agenda. First, Brian Garrett is retiring after 3 years of service to our district, and William Ahern after 24 years of service to Westerville City Schools. We appreciate all they've done for our students, staff, and our community, and certainly wish them the best in the years ahead. Under item 8.11, it is my privilege to introduce to you Kaylee Robertson, who is here this evening. She's recommended for approval in becoming a special education coordinator for the district. Kaylee has spent her last 2 years as an assistant principal at the elementary level at Reynoldsburg City Schools. She has several years of teaching experience as an intervention specialist at Columbus City Schools, Whitehall Prep and Fitness Academy, and the Franklin County Board of DD. She holds a bachelor's degree in education from Heidelberg University and a master's degree in educational leadership with a concentration in special education leadership from the University of Cincinnati. Welcome to Westerville City Schools, Kaylee. Lastly, we have 3 MOUs recommended for your approval this evening. These MOUs are annual renewals between the board and our OPSI 138 and OPSI 719 to permit substitute custodial coverage and transportation substitute coverage while we continue to experience a shortage in these areas. The MOUs outline the details of wages to be earned by our OPSI 138 and 719 employees. These wages are specific to when they're providing substitute coverage. We are deeply grateful to these staff members. I do want to call that out. They are incredibly hardworking, and their dedication, working beyond the regular hours in many cases to help provide this additional support and keep things moving is truly appreciated. At this time, I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Any questions? Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
Yes. And may I take final, old business all as one, too? Are we good with that?
That's great.
All right. May I have a motion to approve all the old business, 9.01 through 9.09?
So moved?
Second?
Any questions, comments, discussion?
These are all the final readings on the policies that we
Yes.
had last meeting, and we have not heard of any concerns or questions, but happy to answer any if you have any at this time.
Nope.
Good.
Okay.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
Yes. And next up, we have the first reading of the student handbooks. Mr. Malkline, welcome.
Thanks for having me back. A little bit of a nicer day today. Last time I was up here 2 weeks ago, it felt like fall. So finally, we're back in the summertime. So hopefully everyone's having a great evening. Thank you, President Meyer, Ms. Hamburg, Ms. Marshall, members of the board. It is my distinct honor to present to you the 3 handbooks for the elementary, middle school, and high school levels for the 2024 and 2025 school years. Oh, thank you, Mr. Cooper. All right. Now we're live. Just a reminder that the handbooks have to go through a committee review each school year at the district level, and then they're presented to the board for approval before the next school year begins. We have a lot of people to thank for their work on this year's handbooks, starting with the young man in the back of the room, Mr. Matt Davis, for his lovely work with the handbook covers. We appreciate him and his work on that. Members of our parent council, specifically Ryan Hilperts and Shannon Lancia for their work and their help with the parent council piece. Also in the back of the room, young lady, Miss Kelly Modlick, the WEA president, and her work and insights, and also members at all 3 levels of WEA with the teachers that provided insights for our committee as well. We are thankful to have the work of administrators from all 3 levels, elementary, middle, and high school, that gave up their time to participate on this committee as well. and my secretary, Miss Molly Bussard, for her insights with the handbook, but also her very close attention to detail. She's been really instrumental in a lot of the work we've been doing here with this. And a special thank you to WCS Transportation and Alan Hunt. He gives a lot of work and a lot of insights on this committee as well, and we're appreciative of his time as we know that he has a very busy schedule. So as you can see, this is a very inclusive process. We have a lot of people that are involved with this, and we want to thank them for their time on this endeavor. It's a big lift, and it's been a lot of work, and we thank them for that. Included with the recommended handbooks are a summary of recommended changes for all three. If anybody has any questions at this time, I'll be more than happy to answer those questions.
Any questions? None. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. All right, next up, we have standing business. And may I have a motion to approve the donations as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Any questions, comments?
Just highlighting the people donating for food service.
Really appreciate, all the
Music.
donations.
Yeah, and all the instruments, I mean, absolutely amazing. We're so grateful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right,
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
yes. And may I have a motion to authorize participation in the Ohio Coalition for Equity and Adequacy of School Funding for the 2024-2025 school year?
So moved.
Second?
And Ms. Marshall, can you explain for people what that actually is?
Yes, so the Ohio Coalition for Equity and Adequacy is, as the name gives you a hint, very interested in equity and adequacy for school funding. So this organization has been around for a very long time. If you're familiar with Bill Phillis, he's sort of heads this up. This is our invoice for our membership dues, but it also, we have joined the lawsuit for the voucher program for private schools. And so this includes the dues for that part of it too. And so we bring this to the board each year for approval, as the auditor sent out a survey a couple of years ago asking about whether these invoices had been board approved. I don't typically have the board approve invoices because you authorize expenditures through the appropriation resolution and board policy and all those things, but they seem to highlight that this should be specifically approved by the Board of Education. So I'm bringing it to you for your consideration, again, for the 24-25 school year.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? All right,
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
yes. And may I have a motion to approve the out-of-state overnight field trip?
So moved.
Second.
Ms. Baldwin, welcome.
Hey, good evening, President Meyer, members of the board, Interim Superintendent Hamburg, and Ms. Marshall. I have one out-of-state field trip for you to consider this evening. This is for Westerville Norse Band to travel to New York City in April of 2025, so they're planning way ahead. And this will be an opportunity for the students to perform as well as participate in a clinic with a New York Philharmonic staff conductor. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions or comments? Sounds pretty fun.
All right,
Okay.
thank you.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer.
Yes. And can I take the next two?
We should probably do them
Okay.
separate. Just
May I have a motion to approve the settlement agreement?
So moved.
Second.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep, ready?
Mrs. Altman,
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson, Mrs. Meyer.
Yes. And may I have a motion to approve the settlement agreement?
So moved.
May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Marshall?
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes. And we have no public comments, so moving along to board comments. Who would like to start?
I just want to thank Ms. Marshall and your staff this time of year when other people are quiet and there's a ton of work coming out of the treasurer's office. So thank you, and everyone who works with you on everything all the work that was behind everything we've seen here this evening. So thank you.
I appreciate that. I do also want to mention HR is just
Yep.
as busy as the treasurer's
Thank
office
you,
is.
HR.
So,
Thank you. Thank you.
I was going to say welcome to Kaylee, but I think she's left. I would just remind anybody that if you missed the curriculum conversation last board meeting, just go back and watch it. If you have any questions, people are always willing to answer them, and you can find the curriculum online. But ditto, and thanks. And the board will meet in regular session on Monday, July 8th, 2024 at 6 p.m. at the Early Learning Center at this building, 936 East Wind Drive, Westerville, Ohio. And may I have a motion to go into executive session for the purposes of considering the discipline and dismissal of public employees and the employment and compensation of public employees?
So moved.
Second?
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes, you're more than welcome to stay if you would like, but
6:48.
don't have to. Okay, well, we are back from executive session, and may I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Ms. Marshall?
Mrs. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Meyer?
Yes.